listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. We have entered the year 2025. That's a long time for some of you, and it's a long time for me. That means I've been on planet Earth for many years. I've been all over planet Earth. And beginning in my childhood, I devoted myself to studying, researching, gathering information, basically with one central focused topic. And the focused topic was, of course, because I write about it in all of my books, why am I here on planet Earth? What is my purpose in life? And what is this reality? What is this lifetime really all about? In other words, why am I alive? And I don't know what it was, is this that most people didn't seem to really care about those questions. I was obsessed with them. I mean, totally obsessed with them. And so I began my journey seeking out the truth. And I dedicated myself to this objective, as a really young child. And so, when you try to discuss this with adults, and God forbid you try to discuss this with your peers or other young people, I mean, you might as well be talking to yourself, because they were not interested. And I still don't get it. How can you not be interested? How can you not be obsessed with wanting to know what your primary purpose in life is and what the meaning to life is all about? I mean, I don't get it. How is it possible for you to live, to be born out of your mother's womb, or however you got out of your mother's womb? How could you go through that process or know about other people who went through that process? And how could you not be obsessed and consumed and driven to find out the meaning of life? Well, I was obsessed and driven and consumed to find out the meaning to life. How could you not be? How could you be rational? How could you claim to be sane? How could you claim to be a person who uses their mind and would inevitably be asking the questions or seeking the answers to life's most important questions? How could you embark on this journey of life? How could you even begin? And even just, I mean, for crying out loud, look up at the stars at night, even in LA with all the chemtrails and the smog, but mainly chemtrails. How could you look up at the dimmed stars at night? And if you're out there in a rural area or the country, those stars are far, far brighter. Or if you're up, let's say, on top of the mountain in Lake Arrowhead, California, you're way above the skyline. The skyline is way below you. And you look up at the stars, and there's no veil of smog or pollution. And I'm not sure if there are chemtrails up now in Lake Arrowhead, but at one time there wasn't any. How could you look up at the stars, which are glistening and clear and sparkling like pins of very bright light? How could you look up at the infinity of stars and not be motivated to want to know, gee, this whole thing called reality is obviously a highly, highly creative endeavor. It's a mind-blowing endeavor. And so because it's a mind-blowing endeavor, and the stars are celestial in their brilliance and beauty, and the moon, depending upon where we are in the lunar cycle, or the sunrise and the sunset, or even in Hollywood, when you make feature films like I did, there was an expression in Hollywood known as magic hour, or the golden hour. And magic hour or the golden hour referred to the fact that at a particular time during the sun rising in the morning, and then again at a particular time when the sun sets in the evening, there is a glorious golden hue, a golden, almost supernatural, heavenly hue that drapes everything in a kind of natural celestial glory. And so the cinematographer, the director, they will often write scenes, and in the notes in the screenplay, they will demand that this shot or that shot be shot during magic hour. Because if you have a romantic couple, you can, unless it's raining out, which it hardly ever rains in LA, but during magic hour, the actors are bathed in a kind of natural celestial glory or golden hue, which is wondrous and beautiful. And it happens because I don't know scientifically why it happens, but from an artistic viewpoint, it enhances greatly your cinematography and your shooting and the facial tones of the actors, etc., and the look of the streets and the trees and everything. So in Hollywood, you call that time period sunrise and sunset magic hour or the golden hour, because it will take sometimes an ordinary scene or an ordinary acting interaction, and by the time you shoot the scene and you go into the editing room to look at what you've shot, it's obvious that what you have shot is supernaturally enhanced by the reality of how the sun bathes the morning and the evening to such an extent that it's called magic hour. It's like a natural version of the glory of God, and it's quite spectacular. So how can you look at that, things like magic hour, and not recognize that this world that we live in, look, let me shoot really straight to you, and I'm going to be very direct. You have to be a quantum idiot. Forget about quantum mechanics and quantum physics. Let's talk about the reality of the fact that a lot of people are just plain old quantum idiots. Quanta coming from the composition of the quantum, or the tiniest of particles in physics. You have to be a quantum idiot to not notice, to not observe the creative majesty of sunrise and sunset. You have to be a quantum idiot when you're looking at the Grand Canyon during magic hour, or you're walking through a forest, or you're up there in Big Sur, California, hanging on, not physically hanging on the cliffs, but hiking on the cliffs. You know, you've seen movies and you may not have known you were looking at Big Sur, California, but Big Sur, California is a very, very narrow community of artists and pseudo gurus and stuff. And they live in modest homes because they want to get away from it all. They want to get back to nature. So they live literally on those cliffs. Are very, I mean, the cliffs are almost go straight down directly, and the cliffs will either drop you into the Pacific Ocean, hopefully not on boulders, or the cliffs in Big Sur, California might drop you into the sand. Whatever the case is, you're looking at nature at its best. And so when you go back into the cliffs of Big Sur, California, you find yourself hiking right smack in the middle of a massive redwood forest, where the diameter of the redwood trees is enormous. And these trees, I don't know, they've been there for thousands of years. These redwood trees are thousands of years old. And so you hike into the forest, and the majesty and wonder of the redwood trees is a wonder to behold. Now, obviously, I don't agree philosophically or artistically. I don't agree with a great deal of what the late writer Henry Miller wrote in his, let's call them philosophical novels. But Henry Miller had a small cabin-like house that still remains in the forest, in the redwood forests of Big Sur, California. I don't ask me how he got it. The property is almost impossible to get. And I wouldn't advise that you go there. And the reason I would not advise that you would go there is because a significant part of Henry Miller's career was the deification of eroticism and art and sculpture and painting and literary works, which is a fancy way of saying, in today's language, Henry Miller, through his novels and through his sculpture and through his paintings, because he did not worship God as an artist, and because he worshiped nature instead, Henry Miller openly, not displayed is too restrained of a word. Let's just say pornographic type sculptures, not pornographic in the sense of any particular action or activity that was going on depicted by the sculptures or the paintings, but the graphic and explicit nudity that was, quote, celebrated by Henry Miller, you'll find it to be offensive. Now, so you might say, well, what were you doing there? I was there because I'd never been there before. And I was familiar with him as a writer. So, yeah, I was somewhat surprised by the explicit nature of his sculptures and his, I already knew about his writing from college. But in any case, when men and women stop worshiping the living God and begin to worship the creature and stop worshiping the creator, they become idolatrous. So if I was going to analyze Henry Miller's literary sculpture works, novels, et cetera, and paintings, if I was going to analyze them, because when you read, the reason I read Henry Miller is because I was always getting into debates, philosophical, creative, artistic debates with a college friend who was also in the film school and was obsessed with many rebel type authors, but he was especially obsessed with Henry Miller. So he would force me in his crusade to convert me into kind of a pagan naturalistic religion. He would force me to read extended paragraphs written by Henry Miller, famous novels that ended up in front of the Supreme Court. They ended up in front of the Supreme Court of the United States because Henry Miller's literary works always seemed to create a controversy regarding freedom of speech and freedom of artistic expression, etc. So my friend would make me read Henry Miller. And so when I read Henry Miller in limited doses, because basically that's all I could take of Henry Miller was limited doses. And so reading Henry Miller in limited doses, it was obvious to me. My friend and I, at that time at the University of Missouri, we were both film majors, and I was a film major and also majored in a brand new field in psychology called altered states of consciousness. So he would make me read Henry Miller, and he was always mocking me because I wouldn't get the show on the road and celebrate the artistic, creative, new age, occultic rebellion that swirled around Henry Miller. So when I read Henry Miller, my experience was completely different than his. It was obvious to me that Henry Miller hated God. It was all over his literary works. You would have had to have been deaf, dumb, and blind not to have recognized that Henry Miller, the famous author, hated God, and he specifically hated the biblical or Judeo-Christian God. So everything he wrote, everything he painted, everything he made in terms of sculpture was an act of rebellion against the biblical God. Now, since you and I are walking down a different path than those who enshrine Henry Miller, it would be obvious to you, and it was obvious to me, that Henry Miller his main thing was not the creativity that he claimed to be a champion of. His main thing, if he was really intellectually and philosophically honest, his main thing was his rebellion against the biblical God and the precepts of the biblical God. That's what Henry Miller was really all about. And so I would read his writings, and I would have to say, yeah, they were, to one degree or another, obscene. Does that mean they weren't art? That's a topic for another discussion entirely. But he had a vested interest in striking out specifically against the Creator, capital C, and the biblical God, the Judeo-Christian God, and the precepts and laws of the Judeo-Christian God. And so what I discovered is probably what you have already discovered, and that is that a lot of these so-called artists and filmmakers and writers, etc., when push comes to shove, they always talk a big talk, okay? And they deceive them before they surrender to an external spirit of deception. They deceive themselves into believing a lie. So for example, Henry Miller and countless other artists and writers and blah, 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 they will begin by deceiving themselves into believing that what they're writing, what they're directing, what they're producing in any of the communications arts or film or video or whatever, they will deceive themselves individually into believing a lie. And the lie is that what they are doing is exempt from scrutiny and accountability because, quote, they're artists. And I don't mean to be unkind, but I am going to be unkind because I grew up with these people. You got to understand that I come from this kind of culture. They always hyperinflate the pomposity of the word artist, or I'm an actor, or I'm an artist, or a director. With their tone of voice, they magnify their societal position. They magnify their societal position, and they kind of self-hype themselves in going into their own private orbit around planet Earth, which is a subtle way, a sneaky way, a deceptive way of deifying themselves. In other words, making themselves like gods, small g. And that's the root of it. That's the root of the dilemma and the conflict raging on planet Earth. That fallen man, because fallen man is fallen and fallen man is sinful, fallen man is in an objective state of rebellion from the true God, the biblical God, period. You can schmooze it up all you want. But when push comes to shove, it's what the whole spiritual war is about, is a war of deception versus truth. And so they self-deify themselves. They assume for themselves a godlike quality. And then the other thing, which always inevitably, at least in my experience, about 100% of the time, what eventually becomes evident for all to see is that, quote, the emperor has no clothes. Remember that parable fairy tale story about the little kid? All the people in some ancient European town had gathered outside. So all the people of this, this story, this fable goes back hundreds of years ago. So all the people of this town gathered outside like people today would gather outside for a big parade or something, because they wanted to catch a glimpse of the king of the land in which they lived. They wanted to capture a glimpse of the king as the king rode by in his horse and carriage with his soldiers. So everybody else was caught up in the deception. All the townspeople were caught up in this deception in the sense that they could not see visually what was plainly obvious. And what was plainly obvious was the fact that the king of this land was in fact totally naked. I mean, he was wearing nothing but his birthday suit. And all the townspeople, praised him, and all the townspeople developed a collective mindset in which they denied the truthfulness of the fact that the king was naked. The only person in the town that told the truth to himself and told the truth out loud to the crowd that had gathered to see the king was this one, pre-teenage boy who was honest. And the minute he saw the king, he could see the king honestly. And in the honesty in which he perceived the king, he observed the fact that the king was completely naked. So he shouted out unabashedly, "The king is naked. The king has no clothes on." And at first, all the townspeople stiffened up the way they stood and their facial expressions, and they ignored the pleas of the pre-teenage boy. They ignored his pleas and his crying out in stating that the king has no clothes on. The townspeople just tuned that truth out and collectively embraced in the deception that the king was beautifully clothed in the finest of linens that only a king could afford to wear. But the fact of the matter was that the king was totally naked, embarrassingly naked. And the only person who didn't succumb to the deception was the pre-teenage boy who just shouted out the truth. The king is naked. The king is naked. The king has no clothes on. Now, finally, after, I guess, 4 or 5 times of this young boy shouting out the truth, the king has no clothes on. The king is naked. About 4 or 5 times after the boy shouted those words out, the collective mindset began to dissolve among the townspeople, and the townspeople kind of began to become sane versus collectively insane. And the townspeople now joined in the shouting at the king. Initially, they were terrified, so they didn't want to admit to the king that he was naked. But about the 5th time that the teenage boy shouted out that the king is naked, all of a sudden, it was like somebody took a pin which popped a balloon, and the people of the town could see the blatant, obvious truth, which was the fact that the king really was naked and he wasn't wearing anything. And this whole thing was just one giant charade, one parade of fools. And then the king looked down at his own attire. The king looked down at his own outfit, and the delusion faded off the king as well. And now the king could see himself as he really was. And that was the fact that the king could now see the fact that the king himself was naked. So the king was no longer swept into the delusion and the deception. The king could now look at himself in truth, and the king was horribly embarrassed, horribly ashamed, because his top advisors, including the man who did the tailoring of his kingly outfit, and lied to the king's face and told him how kingly he looked, when in fact he didn't look kingly at all. He looked like a fool because he was totally naked. Now, you've probably heard of that fable. I'm assuming you have. But that's, in many respects, that's the way our societies operate. Our culture operates along those principles. Collective consciousness, mass hysteria. People will do anything to gain the acceptance of authority figures, and people will do anything to gain the acceptance of the rulers of the lands that they live in. So if everybody around them is praising the king for how incredible he looks, they're going to go along with that game. They're going to play the game that the king looks incredible, and they're not going to own up to the truth, which is the king is naked. He's just totally naked. He looks like a fool. But they won't go there because of fear. And now Christians, by the way, in terms of sociological groups, Christians are among the worst offenders when it comes to sociological groupings and categories. Christians are among the worst offenders of people that will play the inane game in celebrating a lie and celebrating a delusion, and they'll actually rally behind a great deception rather than to risk societal disapproval and tell the truth. And that's one of the main reasons America today and much of the world is in the mess that it's in, because Christians don't have the courage. There's another word I could use, but I won't. But Christians don't have the courage to stand up for the truth, and they succumb to the peer pressure all around them, and they go along with whatever the collective mindset is agreeing to. And if the collective mindset is proclaiming that the king is wonderfully adorned, they're going to go along with that deception. But here in this fable, only the pre-teenage boy had the courage and the guts and the individuality to take a bold stand and walk alone in difference to everybody joining together and embracing the same delusion and deceptive mindset. That's just the way it goes. All right, you're listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. One of the main objectives of the Paul McGUIRE Report is to do exactly what is illustrated in that famous fable where the teenage boy utters to his fellow townspeople those words, "The king has no clothes. The king has no clothes." And so one of our jobs on the Paul McGUIRE Report is to use the internet, to use social media, to use language, books, and other forms of communication, and proclaim in a manner that can go viral, to proclaim the truth about specific matters. Because what puts society, what makes prisoners out of society on a regular basis is whenever society groups together and embraces a lie based on the exception of a lie. And this happens on a constant cyclical basis throughout human history. So our responsibility in winning a spiritual war victoriously is to choose to walk as individuals created by God. And in the process of walking as individuals created by God, we not only need to be willing to stand alone if we're going to stand for the truth, but we need to become the people of God who speak the truth, even that when that means paying the price and cost of defying the collective lies. So we defy the collective lies in order to tell the truth. When we do that, we melt the delusion and the illusion. And when we melt the delusion and illusion, we see the God of this world, Satan, who's the father of lies. We see the father of lies, Satan. We see his lies begin to fade and lose their grip over society. So, for example, communism. Marxism, socialism, National Socialism, secular humanism, transhumanism, all of these systems of thought consists of collective lies which imprison the masses of people. And the only way to defeat these collective lies which imprison the masses of people is to have the courage to creatively, effectively, strategically stand up and speak the truth in love. And to the degree that we're willing to speak the truth in love is to the degree that we will see our fellow citizens, our fellow Christians, our neighbors and family members. It's to that degree that we will see them set free by the power of truth. So the goal of the Paul McGUIRE report is to use social media. It's to use books and articles and videos and verbal communication to conferences and churches and large gatherings. It's to use every form of communication and use it to wage war, spiritual war, against the deception of lies. So the way we're victorious in this kind of spiritual warfare is when we unite together, and every one of us does our part in obeying God in whatever God is calling us to do. So when we ask God, what would you have me do? How would you have me help the Paul McGUIRE report? How can I change my nation and my culture? Well, when we respond to God through obedience, and when we do what God tells us to do, what happens is there's a transformational impact, a transformational effect, if you will, upon a culture, a nation, and a society. And the end result is people stop living in a delusion and an illusion, and people start living in the vibrant light of the truth and the truth of God's word. And the more people we can compel to walk in the truth and live life in the reality of the truth, the more people that we can compel to do that, the faster we will see and witness radical changes and a dramatic reduction in the level of satanic and Luciferian power that has been keeping people in a kind of spiritual prison for decades and decades. So I want to ask you to simply ask the Lord, how much would you have me give or donate or financially contribute to Paul McGUIRE Ministries and Paradise Mountain Church? And whatever the Lord tells you to do in his still small voice, whatever God calls you to do, then simply obey the Lord and give or donate or financially contribute whatever it is that God is telling you to contribute or donate. Just do whatever it is God is telling you to do. And when you do that, it has a powerful, all-comprehensive effect upon the population of any nation. The power of the lies, the power of spiritual darkness begins to fade, begins to melt, and the truth begins to vibrantly emerge, lighting up the darkness. And when this change or transformation is facilitated, there's a radical transformation in any given society where darkness no longer is able to control the population, and the population is now subject to the transformational nature of the light of the Lord. And so we want to do everything that we can, use every media that we can to release the transformational power of the light of the Lord in our nation, our society, our churches, and our culture. And to the degree that we're willing to obey God and follow his directives, it's to that degree, the law of reciprocity, it's to that degree that we will see visibly a corresponding, like, echo chamber effect in the culture, and we will see the culture begin to radically transform itself right before our very eyes. So I want to encourage you, whatever God is telling you to do, whatever God is calling you to do in terms of giving or making a contribution financially, simply obey the still small voice of the Lord and do whatever it is He's telling you to do. And to the degree that you do that, you will see the power of the Holy Spirit, which is the Spirit of truth. You will see the power of God's the transformational power of God's Word. They will all begin to be activated simultaneously, and our culture and our nation and our society and our world will undergo a radical, positive spiritual revolution that will change the world and change our nation. And that should be our goal. And we should remove from our minds and hearts any flirtation or any notion of surrender or retreat or double-mindedness. And we should embrace a mindset absent of fear. We should embrace a mindset absent of any cowardice. And we need to come together as one in the power of agreement and take back the land that the devil has stolen from us. And as we do that, we will see freedom, real freedom. We will see real freedom begin to return in an accelerated manner in our land. Our land will be set free again as God created it to be in the beginning. This is Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. And together we can effectively take back the land. Visit paulmcguire.us. Make sure you electronically follow the Paul McGUIRE Report on whatever social media you're listening to me on. And make sure that you join with us in breaking the rigging theft game. And together we can take back our nation for the Lord Jesus Christ. This is Paul McGUIRE. Visit paulmcguire.us. You are now listening to the Paul McGUIRE Report. I'm Paul McGUIRE. One of the goals of Paul McGUIRE Ministries, the Paul McGUIRE Report, and Paradise Mountain Church, one of our primary goals is to communicate the truth, not only spiritually in terms of salvation in Christ by faith, but to communicate the truth, and to communicate the truth as it pertains to specific current events, specific topics in the news media, specific treatments, specific medical research facts, et cetera, et cetera. So you say, well, why would you have to do that? We would have to do that because we live in a nation and a global society in which criminality, lying, distorting the facts, hiding the facts is the new norm, the new normal. And a lot of ministries and ministers are content to say the theological lie, which goes something like this. Well, I've just been called to preach the gospel. Now I'm going to say it again because I'm going to analyze those words with you and expose just what a devious lie it is. Many, many times in my ministry, speaking across the world, writing books, doing TV, et cetera, I have talked privately or publicly to ministers and ministries, and they have said to me, or they've said to others, the following words or something very close to the following words. And it's kind of their get out of jail card free. Okay, so the verbiage they use to excuse themselves from speaking the truth in love in all relevant areas of life, they give themselves an excuse. In other words, God holds every one of us, not just ministers. God holds average Christians. We are all accountable before God to speak and communicate the truth, whatever that truth is, and in whatever category that truth may emerge in our reality, in our societies, and in our life. Now, this is extremely serious. This is not a peripheral subject, okay? I'm talking about literally life or death regarding you, me, the people we love, children, grandchildren, people that go to our churches or fellowship, people we work with. If we know that they're doing things that have a high percentage or a high likelihood of killing them because the medical and scientific research has reached such staggering heights that it's impossible to ignore the truth, which is often the case in today's society. Make no mistake about it. You and I are not going to be able to stand before God and utter the blasphemous and obscene words that go something like this. Well, I've just been called to preach the gospel. I've just been called to preach the gospel and nothing else. And there are many, many variations of that statement. I've just been called to preach the gospel. No Christian, quote, has just been called to preach the gospel. Zero Christians have just been called to preach the gospel. And every Christian, 100% of them, without any excuse, have been called directly by God to speak the truth in love, to communicate the truth in love in every sector of life, in every sector of reality, so that our fellow human beings, our fellow Christians, our family and loved ones may, to use a Star Trek term, live long and prosper. And if you have knowledge, or you have been deliberately and willfully chosen to avoid the acquisition of knowledge and understanding for the devious purpose of exempting yourself from being responsible before God and accountable before God to preach the fullness of the gospel. In other words, truth is truth. Christianity is truth and not just a religion. So when you and I know the truth about all kinds of things in this reality, such as the fact that certain foods will kill you, certain chemicals will kill you, certain chemicals, certain foods, certain additives, over time, incrementally, will give you an early death and you will die. Now, if you're avoiding knowing these truths so that you can let yourself off the hook, so to speak, and not have to be accountable before God, you are egregiously sinning before a holy God. And you say, well, how can you say that? It's very easy to say it because the Bible says in numerous places that God is love. God is love. And the Bible says, like in 1 John, that we are to love one another. By this will all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So loving one another and speaking the truth in love is a mandatory commandment from God to us. And there's you are spitting in the face of God if you think that you can manipulate your reality, you can manipulate your sources of information so that you don't have to acquire knowledge in all these different areas, some minimal amount of knowledge. So, for example, at a certain point in medicine, it became a well agreed upon medical fact that it was necessary for adults and children to take a wide spectrum of a minimum daily dose of a diversity of vitamins and minerals so that these people would live and have strong immune systems. The taking of these vitamins and minerals are essential to longevity and building up immune systems. They're not just some frivolous luxury item. They're essential to living. Okay? And so it's inexcusable in our modern society, especially like America. It is inexcusable and intolerable for a Christian to exempt themselves from communicating to other people that it is important in order for you to live and build up your immune system. Modern science and medical research has now determined that every adult and every child needs a regular regimen of certain vitamins and minerals. They are the ingestion or taking of these vitamins and minerals are an essential part of living long and maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So everyone should know that, because that information is constantly being spread throughout all of our media on a continual basis. This is not an area of non-agreement. It may be an area of non-agreement in terms of the dosages that are necessary, the minimal dosages. But the fact of the matter is, nobody's debating the reality that these vitamins and minerals are essential to health. So there are many other things too that if you spend a reasonable amount of time, and anybody who's a leader, and a leader could be a mother or a father, an older brother, an older sister, a leader could be a doctor, a leader could be in any number of fields. But a true hear me now, a true spiritual leader is responsible before God to acquire a minimal level of knowledge regarding medical research and the minimal necessary dosages of a diversity of vitamins and minerals so that you can live long. Okay? This isn't even a debate anymore. It's a mutually agreed upon fact. So by making sure that the elderly, those that have mental and emotional challenges, they discovered a prestigious think tank and university in Europe, as well as in the United States, recently released published material that proved that just one vitamin in the right dosages, vitamin D is essential to mental, emotional, psychological, and psychiatric health. Just that mineral alone is essential to psychiatric, psychological health. In the same way, and they tried to hide this, they tried to kill it, they tried to bury it in the mainstream media. And I'm not a doctor, disclaimer, but medical researchers determined that it was absolutely necessary for people to take a minimal and continual dosage of vitamins and minerals like vitamin D and zinc and vitamin C and just a few other vitamins. This small category of absolutely necessary vitamins like zinc and vitamin D were one of the most powerful ways you could build up your immune system and survive the onslaught of things like COVID-19, and other diseases. Okay? So anybody with an ounce of brain power and a minimal understanding of medical research knows that it's a medical fact that zinc and vitamin D are absolutely necessary for building up your immune system, specifically against things like COVID-19 and other diseases. So when we deprive people of this basic information by copping out and using the lame and indefensible excuse that, I've just been called to preach the gospel, giving yourself a self-exemption from not only preaching the gospel, but making sure that you communicate to people the vital importance of taking a minimal dosage of things like zinc and vitamin D. It could save your life. It could prevent you from getting terminal COVID-19 and all kinds of diseases. So God holds you responsible and accountable for not only preaching the gospel, but you're not let off the hook for even a moment by quoting a little lie. Well, I've just been called to preach the gospel. Nowhere in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, does it ever say something so inane and stupid as, I've just been called to preach the gospel. When you say that, you're communicating and preaching heresy. You're preaching spiritual deception. You're preaching a lie. Because nowhere in the Bible are you exempt from ministering the life, the abundant life of the gospel to individuals in all areas of life, including vitamins and nutrition. So think of it this way. Why would you bother to pray for somebody to be healed physically or to be healed of a disease? Why would you pray for somebody or lay hands on somebody or anoint somebody with oil to be healed of any given disease and to be restored to health, if at the same time you're going to deprive those individuals of the basic knowledge and the basic understanding that taking certain minerals like zinc and vitamin D are absolutely essential to maintaining a strong immune system and overcoming and surviving things like COVID-19. Nobody who takes their faith seriously in Jesus Christ would commit the egregious sin of hypocrisy and deprive their brothers and sisters in Christ who they claim to love in Christ, love one another as Christ loved the church. No one would inanely deprive their brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ of the minimal basics that they need to know regarding the essential importance of zinc, vitamin C, and vitamin D in building up your immune system and overcoming things like COVID. Nobody would. So part of being a true disciple of Jesus Christ is acquiring the knowledge you need, the knowledge that is necessary to build up your immune system and to fend off a wide spectrum of diseases by simply exposing people to a knowledge of the truth, which would include a minimal knowledge of the importance of things like vitamin D, zinc, and vitamin C. Okay, let's take it further. As a true Christian, as a true disciple of Jesus Christ, you're responsible to communicate the full gospel and not a partial gospel. And so that means you minister to as many people as you can the essential truth that they need to know in order to live, survive, and thrive. So I'm looking at different medical research reports published by doctors that are respected, medical researchers that are respected. And I just want to read you some partial headlines of what medical doctors and medical researchers are now discovering regarding your health, my health, and the health of people we know. Let's look at, for example, at this fact. Weaponized gene-edited mosquitoes that were deliberately released in Brazil, and this whole weaponization of gene-edited mosquitoes released in Brazil was financed by the Bill Gates Foundation, and the question they're asking is, will it save lives? But why would you weaponize mosquitoes, which could potentially kill hundreds of millions of people? And then you take the nation of India, and the global South should firmly reject the technology of genetically modified insects. So I want you to reframe your mind for a moment. And by reframing your mind, I'm asking you to enhance your perception of exactly what a mosquito is and what a mosquito, the insect mosquito, is not. Understand that on the basis of science and medical research, understand firmly in your mind that when you use a scientific laboratory to deliberately weaponize gene-edited mosquitoes, which is what some of these trillionaire organizations and billionaire organizations are doing. When you weaponize gene-edited mosquitoes, you're releasing mosquitoes into the air, into the environment, which, flying around with their mosquito wings, they function exactly like a flying hypodermic needle that contains things like a COVID-19 vaccine. So scientifically, what is the major difference between a weaponized gene-edited mosquito and a flying hypodermic needle with wings? Because when you inject a hypodermic needle into somebody's veins or arm that has the COVID-19 vaccine in it, you're using the hypodermic needle as a technology to inject a human being with a COVID-19 vaccine, which could potentially kill them. Why? Because if you just look at a weaponized mosquito, you see that a weaponized mosquito functions in a manner that is very, very similar to a hypodermic needle that contains the COVID-19 vaccine. And just imagine wings on a hypodermic needle that contains the COVID-19 gene. And then imagine taking that hypodermic needle and injecting it in the arm of a young child, a baby, or an adult or an elderly person. What are you doing? You're embedding in those vulnerable population groups, you're embedding into their bloodstream, and radically bypassing the blood-brain barrier, which shoots the COVID-19 virus or hypothetical virus directly into the human bloodstream, which can cause potentially death. So there's no difference in my imaginary parable of a hypodermic needle with wings flying around and someone injecting you or somebody else with the COVID-19 vaccine. You inject them with a hypodermic needle that contains the COVID-19 vaccine, which could potentially kill them in a worst-case scenario. Now, in the same way, if you compare, let's call a hypodermic needle that contains the COVID-19 vaccine, let's call it for what it is. It is a technology. A hypodermic needle is a medical technology. When you shoot somebody up with a hypodermic needle that contains the COVID-19 vaccine, you are using the needle as a technology. So in the imaginary parable, if we weaponize or breed billions of mosquitoes to be released, the mosquito as a genetically modified insect, the mosquito can fly around. It senses the proximity of a human being or a baby or an elderly person, and then the mosquito that's been weaponized pierces the flesh with whatever they call that insect probe coming out of the mosquito, and that insect mosquito probe pierces the skin and injects or embeds the COVID-19 vaccine, the COVID-19 gene, directly into the bloodstream of its victim. And then again, potentially that victim could die, especially if they're medically vulnerable. So, right around the time that Bill Gates was financing, allegedly, and releasing these, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of weaponized mosquitoes, which were, quote, biting people and infecting people by shooting its deadly vaccine and deadly weaponized vaccine into the bloodstream of vulnerable populations. I had lived in California, in Los Angeles County. I have been living here for decades, and usually I live up higher, in a higher elevation. Okay, in the higher elevation and in the communities that I live in, there are no swamps. There are no, what you would call breeding grounds for mosquitoes. But in the last couple of years, a very strange and eerie phenomena began to happen. I don't know if it came from, we have like a fountain type area in the backyard. It looks like rocks in nature and like a mountain stream. And then the water collects itself at the base. And hypothetically, even though I keep it clean and sanitized, hypothetically, all of a sudden, I was getting, and my wife was getting, mosquito bites like crazy. I mean, it was like a plague of weaponized mosquitoes were attacking us, like nothing we've ever experienced before, except to a minor degree when we lived on the East Coast. And the weird thing about these, quote, weaponized, allegedly weaponized mosquitoes, the weird thing about them is they had a voracious hunger to bite people like me. And I was being bitten on my legs, my arms, my chest, my back like crazy. I'm talking about 10 bites a day or a night. And the weirdest thing about, and I knew it was a mosquito because how you slap the mosquito when it's trying to bite you, and when you kill it, you can see it's a mosquito. I recognized this insect as a mosquito. There was no question about it. But the thing about these allegedly weaponized mosquitoes was that they created the most powerful, pathologically irresistible desire to itch and scratch where the mosquito bit you, like nothing we both ever experienced before. I have never experienced mosquito bites that created such a sociopathic desire to scratch your own body, itch your own body to the point of using your fingernails to scratch it so hard that you would bleed just to alleviate the itching, the unbelievable itching sensation, which was so bad that one would prefer to have scratched oneself with such ferociousness that you would just bleed, because at least it would stop the craving to itch and scratch. So this went on for a couple of months. And I asked myself over and over again, because this had never happened before living in LA County. It never happened before. And I asked myself, because I was reading reports about these weaponized mosquitoes, even though technically we don't live in a mosquito area, why was I being assaulted with armies of large mosquitoes? And my wife was too. Was it the artificial pond that we had in the back, even though we kept it clean? The mosquitoes were obviously breeding somewhere. Now, they could have bred, 8 blocks away, because a lot of people don't put the timers on their sprinklers for their lawns properly. And so what they call their lawn very quickly turns into like a swamp-like grassy area. And the swamp is only maybe an inch deep, but that's deep enough to breed mosquitoes. So and my wife was being assaulted by these mosquitoes, like constantly. And I continually asked myself, because I was aware of the medical research regarding the artificial breeding of these weaponized mosquitoes, I asked myself, did some clandestine agency artificially weaponize large numbers of mosquitoes with some kind of virus like COVID-19 or something else? Because I've never been bitten more in my life than I had been during the entire 3 months. And I don't know the answer to that question. At this moment, I don't have any immediate symptoms of anything, but I'm always proactive. So I bombarded my body with a again, I'm not giving out medical advice because I'm not a doctor, but I bombarded my body with a diverse spectrum of alternative medicines, alternative vitamins, alternative nutrients, and what some of you may call esoteric type treatments like rife frequencies, because everything is produced by frequency. And not only sound rife frequencies, but biophoton frequencies, which can enter the body through a very specialized, dedicated patch. You embed in your body healing energies via the biophotons, and the biophotons are not a sound frequency. The biophotons are generated by color and light photons and color and light frequencies. So theoretically, anyway, I haven't seen, some outbreak in my life or my wife's life because I didn't wait around. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? I didn't wait around to be victimized. I was proactive. So I want to encourage you to get advice of a qualified medical doctor, compare it to a qualified, emphasis is on the word qualified homeopathic or nutritional doctor, and also doctors that are qualified that specialize in frequency healing and energy healing. Because you don't know. In today's society, you are walking around people, you may be married to somebody, they didn't even get a vaccine, but they are shedding the diseases that come from the vaccine. They're shedding them. And our food supply is contaminated with this stuff. And insects are an exotic delivery system for infecting people, and breathing and food and contaminated water and all kinds of stuff. So you got to remember, and this is my final word to you, you are no longer living in the America of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. You are now living in the dystopian America of the future. In this dystopian America of the future that you now live in, you need to recognize that the evil one and the Luciferian rulers of this dark world have upped the ante in terms of waging all-out war against the human race, including Americans, for the purpose of bringing Americans and other members of the human race to its knees in subjection and surrender to the powers of darkness, namely Lucifer. So whether you like it or not, my dear friends in the Lord, whether you like it or not, you are now presently in an all-out spiritual war, an all-out psychological, psychiatric war, and you are now in an all-out war concerning food and medicine and lack of nutrients and a wide spectrum of things that many of you have never thought about before. If you intend for yourself, your loved ones, your husband, your wife, your children, your grandchildren, those people you love, people you work with, that are open, you got to be very careful before you open your mouth. Because even though you may be technically accurate, and what you say may be the very thing that may keep them alive, they will devour you like starving vampires if you dare to suggest, because they're caught up in their pride, if you dare to suggest that their lifestyle and their choices and the pollutants that they're ingesting are weakening them. I mean, I have talked to people, and you can imagine the response that I get, but you know what? I'm responsible to God. I'm not, if somebody wants to reject, I don't claim to be a doctor. I always give that disclaimer. But if the door is open and the timing is right, and I believe to the best of my ability that I'm being led of the Lord, but again, I'm giving the disclaimer that I'm not a doctor or a medical researcher. I might have a discussion with somebody, and I'll point to them up in the sky, and I'll show them by pointing my finger and talking to them. I'll give them a quick lesson in the difference between what visually normal or so-called normal jet exhaust looks like coming out of a jet and being dispersed over your land and your cars and your communities. And then I will give them a comparison and contrast between what normal jet exhaust looks like and what actual chemtrails look like. And most of the time, people who are honest and can handle the truth, it will become screamingly obvious to them through their visual perception that there's a radical difference in the terms of the visual look of chemtrails and the visual look of so-called normal jet exhaust. Yet if you study what is inside chemtrails, chemtrails contain things like graphene oxide, which turns your body and mind into a broadcaster and a receiver of electromagnetic frequencies. Graphene oxide turns your body, brain, and soul into a broadcasting system of EMF and a receiving system of EMF. And that is dispersed through chemtrails, through vaccinations, and many other transmitters. And then ask yourself the question, why on earth would they put fluoride, which many ignorant dentists claim fluoride is nothing more than an anti-cavity solution? No. The purpose in inventing fluoride from the beginning, it was done by an American engineer and scientist that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi scientists brought into Nazi Germany and the surrounding nations. And it was Adolf Hitler who was the first dictator, and the Nazi scientists were the first scientists to lace the water supply of Nazi Germany and the surrounding nations with toxic chemicals like the tranquilizer fluoride, which basically does nothing to stop cavities. I hate to break it to you, but there is some evidence, admittedly not conclusive, but there's evidence that suggests that fluoride may be a contributor in establishing dementia and other brain diseases. So, fluoride, many scientists and medical researchers allege fluoride does basically nothing to prevent cavities, but fluoride is a chemical that can cause dementia, that can cause Alzheimer's disease, and basically, to put it bluntly, wreck your brain prematurely. So if your end game is to wreck your brain or your loved one's brain prematurely with dementia or Alzheimer's, then go ahead and bathe yourself in the chemtrails. And believe me, you will know, allegedly you should know, but you will know unmistakably, allegedly unmistakably. I got to use all these stupid words for legal reasons. And again, I'm not a doctor, but visually you can tell the difference between chemtrails coming out of a jet and so-called normal jet exhaust coming out of a jet. Now, again, I live high up in the mountains, looking down on LA. So I'm not looking up at the chemtrails most of the time. I'm looking at them at eye level, or I'm looking down at them. And I will say, from my vantage point, which is I'm looking down from a mountain on a massive valley, and I can tell you that I see every day of the week approximately 8 to 10 times a day when chemtrails are being dispersed from chemtrail dispersing jets. They're dispersing the chemtrails somewhere between 8 and 10 times a day. In addition, the chemtrails send out fluoride, and they send out lithium, which is just a old-fashioned tranquilizer. So why would they dose you with tranquilizers, dementia-producing chemicals, other chemicals that kill the brain? Why? What's the reason? They're socially engineering you. They want to dumb down your brain, dumb down your perception, dumb down your analytical and critical thinking abilities so that you will look at, and I've stood and talked to people while I've gone through this process with them. I'll point at the difference between chemtrails and so-called normal jet exhaust. And even though you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to be able to recognize the very distinct differences between the so-called normal jet exhaust and what chemtrails look like. The chemtrails are usually sprayed in a, what's that game, that game? Checkers. Chemtrails are most often sprayed like a checkerboard. So it's a series of squares going in different directions. But not all the time. That's one way instantly you can recognize chemtrails, is that they leave a checkerboard pattern of thin streams of jet exhaust that as the hours go by, the wind disperses into a kind of amorphous cloud. In fact, it looks exactly like smog used to look before they began putting in all the environmental regulations in LA to get rid of the smog crisis. But isn't it interesting? They get rid of all the smog because the cloudy material was killing people. So they get rid of all the smog for environmental reasons. But in the same time period that they got rid of all the smog, all they did was replace the smog with even worse, toxic, brain-killing, disease-creating chemtrails that saturate LA County and the valleys of LA County and the streets of LA County with they're dispersed like a foggy pollutant mixture, just like smog. Often I'll leave my car or cars outside and park on the street. And if I leave them out more than a day or two or a week or whatever, the car is covered with a kind of white soot, like a white powdery mixture. That white powdery mixture is the result of chemtrails. And then the whole long list of toxic chemicals that go with it. Now, conversely, when I'm pointing up the sky, talking to people, I only do it if they're interested. And even then, many people can't handle it. They can see it, and then I watch them turn their brains off. Jet exhaust releases pollutants. But when jet exhaust is dispersed, it's wide, it's thick, it disperses like a massive continuous cloud formation over the valleys. So there's a distinct difference between jet exhaust and chemtrails. Now remember, chemtrails will often look like checkerboards, but sometimes chemtrails will be caused by low-flying jets flying over the valleys of Los Angeles County and everywhere across the United States. The chemtrails will leave thin, mile after mile after mile. They'll leave a thin line, a thin pencil thin line of what appears to be jet exhaust, but it's a chemtrail. And the way you know is that instead of it being like a checkerboard, it will be a checkerboard type of release of pencil thin jet exhaust that may just go horizontally for miles and miles and miles, or just go vertically for miles and miles and miles. But I think that they release the different patterns, checkerboard versus just endless miles of pencil thin, chemtrails. I think they make the decision via their instruments and computers about what kind of pattern they're going to use in the chemtrails based on wind conditions, atmospheric conditions, heat, cold, and all the other things. Because the checkerboard probably works good in certain environmental conditions, and then the endless stream of thin pencil-like lines that eventually the wind disperses as it looks like smog is used for different environmental factors. But when you look at the chemical analysis of what the heck is in these chemtrails and what the heck is in the jet exhaust, it's disease-causing agents. It's all kinds of agents that are designed to amplify and accelerate EMF, electromagnetic frequencies, and so on and so forth. Okay, so what do you do with this information? You don't typecast yourself as a nut. You speak very strategically and very sparingly. You don't allow yourself to be the nut of somebody else's paranoia creation. You very strategically and very methodically, you recognize you're fighting both a spiritual warfare and a psychological warfare. And the name of the game is you have to be more effective and be more scientifically sound than those people that are releasing the chemtrails. If you fail to do it that way, you will be marginalized as a nut, as a conspiracy theory. As such, your effectiveness will be reduced to zero. And that's not what you want. We're fighting for the hearts and souls of mankind. So join me. Many people, most people, including alternative media people, won't talk about this. I know about the real story about a lot of alternative media stars, if that's what you want to call them. Many of them you probably listen to on a regular basis. But because I've been around for decades and decades, I just happen to know through research, credible research, I just happen to know the real story and the real facts behind many of these alternative media personalities. Who they really are underneath the masks, who they're really working for underneath the masks. And I know of many of the biggest ones, the ones that have 250,000 viewers or listeners, the ones that have 1 million viewers or listeners. How do you think they got such huge numbers? Just by delivering good content? Don't be naive. I know the real story of these guys and girls, because I've been around a long time before they came around. And I know the real story behind many of them, like who trained them, what agencies trained them, what methodologies they're using and employing in psychological warfare or psyops. Because they're Trojan horses. They pretend to be conservatives and Christians. Now, you notice you're being sucker punched till you're black and blue and you don't even know it. I said you're being sucker punched until you're black and blue and you don't even know it. These people are like chameleons. They change their identity constantly in order to deliver their message of hardcore propaganda to the people you know. And sadly to say, Christians are the most gullible of just about any group. Have you noticed, I'm sure many of you have you noticed just what a high percentage of alternative media stars there are who are now, just when it's convenient, they're now converting to being evangelical or born-again Christians? If one was ignorant, one would falsely assume and falsely think that a genuine revival is going on among the alternative media stars with all the announcements and testimonies you hear from them about their conversions to Jesus Christ. I mean, every fifth one has had a miraculous conversion to Jesus Christ. Why do you think that happened? Because the intelligence agencies and the propaganda agencies were observing people like me very, very carefully for decades. That's not bragging, that's a fact. And they were not only observing people like me for many, many decades, they were observing other people very much like me for decades and decades. And they noticed that we had an incredible bonding and an incredible rapport and following with our very large audiences. And they were troubled because they couldn't seem to steal our listeners and watchers. So They did what all propagandists did. The bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. All of a sudden, they're all now getting saved, reading the Bible, talking about Jesus in record numbers. But I was around, and some of you were around, not just for the last 10 years or the last 5 years where they're all getting saved. I just happened to be around longer than just about any of them. I've been around for like 40 years. And I remember when they used to mock and attack Christianity. And then you say to me, well, they got saved. You should thank God. I would thank God if I thought that they were genuinely saved. But if they're being saved and making public announcements of their testimonies in Jesus Christ, then why don't they ever touch and handle the really high voltage topics that will make or break our nation, America? And why is it when they give their testimonies, it's always Christianity light? Wake up, fool, wake up. You're being played. I'll say it again. You're being played. You're being sucker punched. So don't be fooled. Some of the salvations are legitimate, but you need to discern between the legitimate and the you're being played ones. Now, just because a person has a lot of wealth doesn't mean they're bad. I don't have a lot of wealth because I give my wealth into the ministry, and I have for decades. I'm not saying I'm better or more spiritual than anybody else. But I don't have the wealth that some of these alternative saved media stars have because I pour all my money back into the ministry. And yesterday, I just happened to, this happened by accident. And, oh no, I think it was TikTok or something, fired this little 3-minute, 4-minute video short up on my computer. Now, I knew about this guy for years because I suspect he's been working for the intelligence agencies on the opposite side for a long time. Then he switched over to alternative media, and more recently, he's become a born-again Christian. Okay. But then when TikTok gave me this video of his $60 million house, I'm not going to give his name, but he owns a $60 million house in the remote hills of Palm Desert, California. They call it Billionaire's Row. And I'd love to have a house like that. He had a gorgeous, futuristic, totally incredible $60 million mansion tucked up in the hills of Palm Desert, looking like a science fiction house. It was just incredible. And I said to myself, it's great. I'd love to have a house like that. But I don't have advertisers who will drop $1 million a year. And it's not because I don't have the numbers. I don't have the numbers because I don't have the invisible promotion behind me. This guy and many guys like him who also have mansions, and there's nothing wrong with mansions. You do what you believe God's calling you to do. I believe God called me to pour the money back into the ministry. I'm not bitter over their wealth. I'll be honest with you, I'd love to have a mansion like that, but I don't want people listening to me to think that that's what I'm all about. So, he has the $60 million mansion and other houses, and so do a lot of them. And the reason he has that incredible wealth and mansions and stuff is because he has a steady stream of mega advertisers, the big globalist corporations that are dropping big bucks into his show. Whereas I get a letter from Google about once a week or once a day. I get a letter from Google and some of the other big social media channels. And the letter, I'm going to read you the letter I get from Google once a day or once a week. And it always starts out by saying, we're sorry, but our advertisers, so that's the money, our advertisers have determined that the topics you cover are too controversial for them, and therefore our advertisers have declined to advertise on your show, which means I don't have a sugar daddy that's going to feed me $1 million on a regular basis, and I don't have a whole bunch of them. $1 million. He's making $100 million, $200 million, $300 million a year as an alternative media star. Well, that's fine if he earned it the old-fashioned way, but he's getting it by softening the truth in order to get the big bucks. Well, I guess I'm stupid because I'm not softening the truth. I don't want on my conscience the people who died. So I guess I'm stupid because I'm not willing to compromise the truth and dilute the truth in order to get myself a mansion that I admittedly would like to have. My wife doesn't like it, but I'd like to have it. I'm not willing to do that. Now, I didn't mention his name. I spoke the truth in love. If I wanted to, I could give you a list of 25 to 50 of the biggest names in social media, alternative social media. And the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them are paid propaganda agents that are being funded by the tune of millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars every year by Christians. And yet I preach the gospel. I lead people to Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. I, at one time, before they were artificially propped up, had numbers that vastly exceeded most of these people. Most of these people didn't even know the names of the organizations that I would regularly quote. There were some that did, the ones that were around for a long, long time. And my hat is off to them. And again, don't mistake the equation. I'm not saying because you have a mansion or you're wealthy that you're corrupt. I'm not saying that. I've never said that. But I happen to know something about a lot of stuff about some of the backgrounds of some of these people. And so when I ask you to pray and ask the Lord who you should donate or financially contribute to, I'm assuming, and maybe I'm stupid, I'm assuming that my audience is going to do a little alternative media homework on who they're donating to so that they give to the people, the good guys, not the bad guys. I think you would be stunned if I ever dropped the payload and told you who's who and what intelligence agency they were groomed by. I think you'd probably melt. Not all of you, but many of you. Now I'm not here to whine and complain because I am doing what I want to do. So I'm not complaining and I'm not bitter and I'm not jealous. Hey, I like that house. My wife doesn't. So guess what? If mama ain't happy, well, nobody's happy. So if it means that I don't get the big advertising dollars because I'm not going to compromise, so what? Because you know what I got instead? Happiness, joy, peace of mind. And what I measure success by is not success. If you're measuring success, because a lot of my Christian followers measure success by how big a mansion Paul McGUIRE has. Well, let me tell you something. Paul McGUIRE doesn't even have a mansion. Yeah, I'm going to say it again. I don't even have a mansion. I deliberately buy modest cars. I have a nice house, but it's no mansion. I drive modest cars because I don't want to mess with the heads of the people that are sacrificing to follow me. I want them to know without a shadow of a doubt that I'm the real deal. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm the real deal. And there are others who are the real deal. Make no mistake about it. I know a lot of them who are the real deal, others. On that note, I'll leave and I'll ask you to ask the Lord how much you can contribute financially or give. Because you see, I don't get these big advertisers, and it's not because I'm incompetent. It's not because of production values. It's not because of any of those reasons. It's because I blow the whistle on the people that are creating substances delivered by mosquitoes in detail. I dropped the payload on them. You understand what I'm saying? I dropped the payload on them. In other words, I'm willing to drop the payload on the devil. You know what that means? When you drop the payload on the devil, it means you get blowback. It means you get fired upon. And I'm not talking about bullets made out of metal. I'm talking about EMF hits and a whole bunch of things that some of you know nothing about. And you don't hear me talk about it very much, and you don't hear me complain about it very much, because I'm in it for real. You got it? So ask the Lord who you should give to, and maybe spend a few minutes checking out the background. And not the background. Look, don't go to the fact check site. Don't go to some George Soros funded operation, which is nothing more than a hit piece against conservatives. Because George Soros people, they're attacking the alternative media people, some of them who have mansions, but at least they're telling some truth, for crying out loud. And I take my hat off to them for telling some truth, because you can tell by who's attacking them, who they're working for. And if Soros is spending money to hire hit squads to bring them down, they must be doing something right, right? This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. And guess what? Ask the Lord how much you should give, and do whatever he tells you to do, and do a little homework. That's the only way we're going to win the war. Knowledge is power. And please don't mistake my remarks as holier than thou. I'm not holier than anybody. I'm saved by grace, my friends, the blood of Jesus Christ, and by faith, lest any man should boast. But I've been in places that a lot of people have not been. I have walked in the hallowed sacred halls of Fox News in its glory days, meeting with the very top executives of Fox News Network about getting my own show like Tucker Carlson has now. And I'm not saying anything negative about Tucker Carlson. So far, what I've seen from him has been good, so I'm thankful for what he does. But I've walked in the same rooms he has. And I didn't get the job, not because I wasn't qualified, and not because I didn't hit the ball out of the ballpark. Let me say it again. I walked those halls. I saw the politics. I was in the inside of the inside of the inside. Okay? And I'm not knocking a lot of people, because you can't judge from the outside what's happening in the inside. In any case, God bless you. I need you to really stand with me. You decide. You listen to the Holy Spirit. You exercise the discernment. And if you do that, we'll win the war. God bless you. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. And again, I want to unmistakably say, even for those in alternative media who I would rather see you give people the benefit of the doubt than listen to the fact checkers and the Soros-funded Nazi hit squads. I would rather see you, if you don't know something about someone, give them the benefit of the doubt, and until you do, shut up. I mean it. Shut up and give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't be so quick to assume that everybody's a sellout. You understand what I'm saying? Straight from the heart. This is Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.